Hello, I'm Maria Takahashi, and welcome to this episode of News for Our Future. For a typical 17 and 18-year-old, the day after high school graduation is when the mind is set on the future campus life in a new environment. But few students opt to take a year between high school and college, not only to take a look at different countries, but explore and immerse in many unfamiliar territories, pushing beyond their comfort zone to get a bigger picture of how people live today all over the world. We are interviewing several students who have been spending a year with a nonprofit organization called Thinking Beyond Borders. First, let me introduce the students. Mary Bryan is from Arlington, Virginia. Rachel Jordan from Atlanta, Georgia. John Rosenthal from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Rain Reel from Brooklyn, New York, and Connor Brooks from Atlanta, Georgia. And now I understand that you are all involved with Thinking Beyond Borders. Tell us about this organization.
Well, TBB is a community committed to changing the world by translating learning into action. The TBB mission is to empower youth as agents of proactive change by developing consciousness of global issues and to translate their learning into action.
Most organizations would only dream to state what you just said as their mission, and it's probably easier said than done. So how does TBV actually go about trying to translate learning into action?
Well, we're a gap year program for students between high school and college, and we all, along with 9 other students, traveled to 7 different countries studying development issues. And we did that through experiential learning, classroom learning, and cultural immersion through homestays.
So how has this worked in your case?
Well, the 13 other students and we studied 4 core issues that relate to development: environment when we were in Ecuador, education in China, sustainable agriculture in India, and public health in South Africa.
So those are a lot of critical issues to cover. How do you manage to fit all of that in?
Yeah, so what we do is we have 4 main countries, as he spoke about, which are Ecuador, China, India, and South Africa, which we usually spend 4 to 6 weeks in. And then we take a break in what we call enrichment countries, which would be Peru and Cambodia. So yeah, that's how we fit it in.
How many people are in your traveling group, and what countries did you visit?
There were 14 students and 3 teachers. We went to 7 different countries. We started off in Costa Rica for a 2-week orientation. Then we went to Ecuador to study the environment and natural resources. And then we went to Peru to hike the Inca Trail and on our way to Machu Picchu. And then China, we studied education. Cambodia, we saw Angkor Wat and the Killing Fields. India, we studied sustainable agriculture. And our last country was South Africa, where we studied HIV, AIDS, and public health.
Extensive week, enrichment of every sort. I can definitely sense that. So you went all over the world to learn about the economic, environmental, and cultural aspects of development, as well as, I suppose, how to give back to your host, with each region having its own strength, but also its limitation. How did your learning experience differ in each country? Let's start with you, Connor.
Well, the learning experiences differed a lot based on the culture. We went from the jungles of Ecuador, and in a 2-week period, we're traveling from Ecuador to China, where we lived in a reasonably large city of about 6 million people. And just going between all these different cultures and seeing the big gaps between the social norms and customs, and being able to compare that to the United States helped us reflect on our culture along with the cultures that we were living amongst.
Well, our learning experience also differed a lot in each country based on the topic that we were studying. I guess that we did different kinds of experiential learning based on whatever topic we were studying. So, for example, in Ecuador, when we were studying the environment, we did a reforestation project with the Satchula community, which is an indigenous tribe that we are living with. And so I think that we learned a lot in terms of what's required on the ground to have sustainable projects that affect the environment in positive ways. And then when we were in China studying education, we actually got to teach in the classrooms in China. And we were teaching English to high school students. And so that was extremely interesting for us to be able to compare our own experience in the United States and then to be able to actually be in the classrooms in China. So I think the service projects affected a lot of my learning.
I think, like Connor, I think that the biggest learning experience for me was in Ecuador when we went to this extremely rural, ancient-seeming tribe and had to bathe in the river and no running water, no internet or cell phone service. So I think I learned the most from them at that first country.
What is the resource that really kind of defined, or what was the most limiting resources as you traveled across all these countries that like really hit you, like, oh, there's not enough water, or wow, the education system, you know, we're really fortunate we have it all, or what really strike you as kind of the limiting resources?
Well, it seemed like most of the issues that you mentioned were extremely connected in all of the countries. So when there was limited education, there was also limited healthcare, things like that. But I know that it was different for each country. Specifically, like in Ecuador, like Mary mentioned, there was no running water, but some of the families had televisions and stereos. So they didn't have taps, but you know, they had other things that we would consider secondary. But for some reason, that took precedent over things like running water.
I see.
And then a lot of the opportunities that we take for granted in American life to be whatever we want to be aren't present in a lot of the countries that we visited. For example, China, when you are finishing high school, you take one test, one standardized test that determines exactly where you go to college and pretty much exactly your career. So when you're a senior in high school, you're taking a test to determine the rest of your life. And you don't have the option to go be a vet if you get a certain score on the test. It's very limiting. America is the land of opportunity, and we saw that a lot while we were traveling abroad.
So has this experience challenged or confirmed your assumptions about these countries that you visited? Rachel, can you share with us part of your journey that you were quite surprised with what you saw?
Sure. Well, one of the major components of the TBB curriculum is challenging assumptions. And so every single country we went to, I'd say countless assumptions were challenged. But one specifically that stands out in my mind was in China. We stayed in the city Kunming, which is in southwestern China in the Yunnan province. And when they described it to us, they described it as a small city in China. And so I was kind of expecting it to be, you know, a small city. But small for China was 12 million people, I think, in the city. And so it was really giant, in my opinion, and extremely developed, seemed very westernized. And I wasn't expecting that at all in China. And so then that became my assumption of what China was like. And then as a group, we traveled to Shaxi, which is a rural village a few hours outside of Kunming. And then it was like we were thrown back hundreds of years. And it was much less developed, very rural. I had fresh squeezed cow's milk every morning for breakfast. And so I guess my assumptions were constantly being challenged throughout the entire trip.
Another assumption of mine is that people's views in regards to Americans. I know in the media and other forms of media, we've been reading a lot about how countries are starting to have a very negative view on America and our policies. But from what I saw, a lot of the people that we were with had very positive views on America, and they didn't think very negatively. And I'm seeing that the media is partly misconstruing some of the beliefs of the people, and it was really nice to get to know like the people on the individual level and see where they came from, a lot of core issues, and try and get a better understanding of those issues through them.
Yeah, I was definitely expecting people to, not to hate us necessarily, but to have a negative view of Americans, and we were greeted with love and, I don't know, kindness everywhere we went. People wanted to come up and take pictures with us, and were really interested in learning about what Americans were like, which was very interesting.
Were there anything in particular that they were attached to U.S. for that you didn't really think that was really American?
Well, in China, I was living with my host mother in Kunming, in the city that Rachel and Connor mentioned, and what she would keep coming back to was Americans and their wealth. And I think she really wanted to emulate Americans and their wealth. But I also think that what many of them want is also freedom, because they're in a totalitarian state. It took a long time for my host mom and me to warm up to each other, to begin to trust each other, because there's a communication barrier when you don't really speak Chinese, and she doesn't really speak English very well either. But so one day we were going to the zoo in Kunming, and the zoos there are different from zoos in America, because at least the ones I go to in America, they're a lot more open, and the animals aren't just in concrete cages anymore. They used to be, but they aren't anymore. And the point is, I told her that those animals looked sad because they weren't free, and then she told me that they are like the Chinese people because she is not free, and I'm lucky to be an American. So I took that to heart, and so I think that what they're interested in China at least, is about freedom, human rights, wealth, things like that. In South Africa, I had an assumption going in that in South Africa we were working on public health and studying HIV/AIDS and the epidemic relating to that. We would work with caregivers that would go to different people's homes in townships, which are a result of apartheid in South Africa, which ended in the 90s, but townships are a result of that and a result of segregation. It's basically where non-whites live. So there's lots of diseases there. AIDS is an outbreak there. It's very sad. But what's going on, at least where we were, is that there are clinics and there's access to prevention and to treatment of different diseases. HIV is a virus, but there are ways to prevent it, such as using a condom, getting educated. There's also tuberculosis. There are drugs you can take to treat that. So I thought that with access, which there is access in the townships there, these problems would be solved, but they still aren't being accessed. And so that was an assumption that I had going in, that if there's access, the problem will be solved. But that wasn't true here because of poverty and because of different causes and effects relating to that.
Mm-hmm. There were a lot of complexities to all the issues that we studied that I think that we weren't anticipating.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the development books that we read before the trip outline clear solutions to ending poverty, and some were as simple as increasing the amount of aid flow, and others were just restructuring the system. But it's so much more than that. You have to get on the ground and go and see what's making these communities tick and see what's stopping the process, because 9 out of 10 times it's more than just getting someone medicine. There's going to be an element, like Rain just touched on, with getting them to take the medicine and believing in the medicine.
I see.
Yeah, in William Easterly's White Man's Burden was one of the books that we read, and it talked a lot about just getting the bottom working poor onto that first level of economic development, and that was huge in India. And also Easterly talks about women's empowerment, and another big topic in India, and slowly but surely more and more women are being employed, more and more people are being employed through the technology sector. So that's just getting more and more people onto the economic ladder is a huge step for development.
Before we came back to the United States, we read a book called There Are No Children Here, and that kind of addresses poverty in the United States. So it was very interesting, after we traveled to all these countries and seen all these different issues, to come back to the United States and see that all of these problems are still here, and that while we were abroad, thinking about the sustainable agriculture in India, for example, we had unsustainable practices going on in the United States at the same time. And so kind of assuming that the United States was totally developed and realizing that it's not that way.
Mm-hmm.
And going off that, South Africa, with their AIDS treatment, they guarantee it completely free. And now people may have to spend money on taxi to get to the clinic, but the ARVs and the medicine to put the virus into remission won't cost them anything. And here in the U.S., one of the richest countries in the world, some of our poorest people are not allowed to get ARVs because they don't have an insurance carrier or their medical plan won't cover the ARVs. And a lot of it's because of their huge expense. But we've seen policies abroad in countries that America and other Western countries deem underdeveloped. And a lot of the time these policies are even better than America's. It's just sometimes a problem of not having enough resources and other glitches within the system. So I think in the U.S. there's sometimes not enough awareness. Mm-hmm. South Africa, public enemy number one is HIV/AIDS. You have a prevalence rate upwards of 20%, and when it gets that high, your working population is affected, and it is a huge drain on the economy and the society. But here in the U.S., we might have a lot of infections, but our prevalence rate is very, very low. Mm-hmm. And it's not enough to create a significant impact on the U.S. economy or society like it does over in South Africa. So issues like AIDS might get overlooked back home in America.
But there are starving children in the U.S. and they, and I don't know if it's an issue of unawareness or just a covering up, or if our system is better even if it's still failing. But there's definitely a lot of problems here that we haven't really figured out how to solve ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the reason why we haven't been able to solve a lot of problems is because people in general don't think outside of the box in terms of questioning their assumptions and really getting to the core of the issue, which people, at least I think people in our group, found out it isn't really an issue, it is more issues. At least I realized that everything is connected in that the environment, public health, education, and agriculture, all of the topics we studied on the trip, all really are dependent on each other and either can work towards a positive change or can be detrimental to each other. And this works along with society and the economy. So for example, when you cut a tree down in Ecuador, it doesn't just harm the environment, it also harms agriculture. And not really harm, but it also affects all of these different things.
See, so now with the concern within the U.S., so you said it's surprising some of these things aren't dealt with well in the U.S. Is that something you started to think about during this trip or after you came back, or was that always in your mind? When did that transition start? Or maybe you already always thought about that.
I think it was more after coming back, because when we were abroad, we were so focused on each of the individual countries and that issue, and then coming back and realizing, at least for me when I was reflecting and when we were in New York and in Washington, D.C. earlier in the month, it became clear to me that all these problems were here, and it was a big synthesis moment for me to see that the problems are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as if we didn't realize that there were some issues in the United States, or that we thought we were perfect, but that we thought the problems were so much bigger in other places. And in some cases they are. There are far more starving people in India than there are in the United States, but we were able to make really personal connections to all the people in the countries that we visited that were really affected by these issues, and that we maybe hadn't had personal connections with people in the United States, at least not, living with them, that kind of connection. And so being able to take our experiences abroad and apply them to people in the United States, that the people that we saw suffering in India, there's also that suffering in the United States, and that locally we have the resources and the ability to do something about it. And that was a really cool thing to see coming back into the United States, that you don't have to be abroad in order to affect change.
Visiting foreign countries can be an adventure, but at the same time, a struggle at the same time. And from me, just going from one country to another, that was already a big culture shock. And I'm curious as to what was your difficulty when you were trying to adjust to these different countries?
Well, for me, it was not necessarily adjusting to different countries, because I'm usually, at least I think I'm adaptable when it comes to different cultures and being open-minded. But for me, living with the same people for a long time can be challenging at times, although also very rewarding. But for me, being an only child, not really having any siblings growing up, now I have siblings.
Yeah, just